Well, welcome everybody to the April edition of the Sheep and Goat webinar that is put on by the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and South Dakota State University. I'm Melinda Ellison. I'm the sheep specialist for the University of Idaho. My co-hosts, we have Chad Page on today with us. So he'll probably pop in at some point later on. He's the small ruminant specialist for Utah State University. And not on today, we have Carmen Wilmore, who's with the University of Idaho, and Jalen Whaley with South Dakota State University. So the four of us are a great team, and we put these on once a month for you, bringing you all kinds of different specialists from different walks of the sheep industry and the goat industry. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Kevin Welsh, who's with the USDA Poisonous Plant Research Laboratory in Utah. And he comes to us from a PhD at Utah State University in toxicology, as well as a postdoc at the National Institutes of Health in the Laboratory of Molecular and Cellular Toxicology. The focus of his current research is to determine the mechanisms of action of poisonous plants in livestock, including a number of plants that contain compounds that are teratogenic. His research program includes studying the effects of mixtures of poisonous plants and their toxins, and the toxic kinetics of plant toxins in numerous animal species. So today, specific to sheep and goats, but also to cattle. And so I will let you go ahead and take over, Dr. Welsh. It's a pleasure to have you, and we're looking forward to your talk today.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to this group. It's an important part of agriculture in the United States, and hopefully I can provide some information that'll be helpful. So today I just want to talk about some plants that we work on that tend to be problematic for small ruminant species, primarily sheep, but from what we're finding, goats and sheep for a lot of poisonous plants tend to have a similar response. So gotta figure out. So I work at, as mentioned, I work at the USDA Poisonous Plant Research Laboratory in Logan, Utah. And the mission of our lab essentially is to learn as much as we can about poisonous plants and how they affect or adversely affect livestock species. So we try and determine and identify what the toxins are, what those toxins do to the animals, under what conditions the animals eat these plants, and then we take all that information and develop some management strategies and some treatments that will help provide ranchers and livestock producers with some methods that they can try and minimize the losses due to these poisonous plants. So as a toxicologist, kind of our mantra in toxicology is that the dose makes the poison. And this is definitely the case for poisonous plants. A lot of poisonous plants can actually be a nutritious and good forage for animals as long as they don't eat too much too fast. Now, there does tend to be some plants that it doesn't take very much for them to become poisoned. But for a lot of plants, such as alfalfa is a great example. If cattle eat alfalfa, normally they're just fine. But if they eat green alfalfa, they eat too much of it too fast, they can bloat and die. So almost anything, any plant can be poisonous if it's eaten and too much of it. And an example of this is some pictures that I'm showing here where it's a rangeland here in northern Utah that typically is a very good rangeland, especially for sheep. This is an area where some sheep producers have brought their animals in for years and had very good gains on these areas. But due to the fact that there are poisonous plants on this, if the conditions are just right, the animals can have an adverse effect. And as you can see, the picture of the sheep here on the right had a very adverse effect. There are some factors that do play into how much an animal will eat. And what we have found is that in general, animals that are in poor body condition tend to eat more poisonous plants. And part of that is just because they're hungry and they're looking for anything, and so they'll eat more of what they than what they normally would have, or sometimes some of these poisonous plants are not very palatable and the animals won't eat them unless it's the only thing available to them. So in general, our recommendation is for livestock producers that are going to put their animals on a rangeland that contains poisonous plants to try and ensure that the animals are in good body condition. There's some other things that we can do as livestock producers to entice the animals to eat poisonous plants. As I'm showing here on the left, this is a patch of larkspur, which for sheep and goats is not a problem, but for cattle it is. And you can see that the rancher put a salt block right in the middle of a larkspur patch. And so this salt block, would actually bring the animals into this larkspur patch and could become a problem. So there's things that we can do to try and keep our animals away from the dense patches of poisonous plants. What I'm showing on the right is a watering trough, and as you can see, and as everybody knows, that the area surrounding a water trough often gets beat down, and you get a lot of bare ground. And what you can get in those areas of the bare ground are some invasive plants that can come in. And for example, halogeton is one that often can come in an area such as this. And so some of these areas of bare ground can become hotbed for some poisonous plants. As I mentioned, some of the work that I've done in the last few years, we've found that for a number of poisonous plants, that sheep and goats tend to respond very similarly. So in general, when I talk to people and they ask about goats, what I'll tell them is unless we know differently, we expect that a goat will respond the same as a sheep. So as I mentioned, for example, larkspur, cattle are susceptible to larkspur, but sheep are not. And so people use sheep to go in and graze these larkspur infested areas before cattle as a way to try and prevent the poisoning in the cattle and utilize that rangeland for the sheep. And we found that goats respond the same way, that they're very resistant to the toxicity of larkspur. So today what I'm going to talk about is some plants that tend to be problematic for sheep, and we will assume for most of these that goats will respond very similarly. Some of the plants that tend to be more of a concern are the yew, skunk cabbage, which has a lot of different names, death camas, lupin, local weeds, halogeton, greasewood, and horsebrush. Those tend to be have some pretty large impacts for the sheep in the western United States. Some plants that also can be a concern are chokecherry and serviceberry. Those are plants that have cyanogenic compounds in them. Lamb's quarter and curly dock have oxalates similar to the greasewood and halogeton. And then you have the dogbane and the milkweeds that have some cardiotoxins that can be toxic if the animals eat them, but they're usually plants that the animals aren't in most of the mountain rangelands, or they don't eat them unless their food is scarce. So I'll go through a few of these and give a little bit more detail. And then at the end, I'll take time for any questions that people might have. But so yew is one that is kind of interesting. It's not a native plant, so it's not found in the mountain rangelands or in our pastures. It is an ornamental plant that people like to plant around their homes, around their businesses, community buildings. Utah State's campus used to have quite a few of these around the buildings. It's a small shrub and it's an evergreen, so it's a nice ornamental plant. It has these pretty red berries on them. And so it's very appealing. The problem is it is also extremely toxic. It has a cardiovascular toxin in it, and the very small amounts can kill a large animal, such as what we're showing here is some cattle that died. And typically what happens in livestock scenarios is they're not grazing these, but rather somebody either uh, clips the shrubs to cut them back, or they take the shrubs out altogether and then they dump those clippings or the shrub into the feed bunk or the paddock for the livestock. And those animals will eat that. And as I mentioned, it's very toxic. So, like the picture I'm showing here, what happened was a neighbor took out one of their yew shrubs and threw it over the fence to the neighbor's cattle, and the cattle ate it, and they had 35 animals that died overnight. We also had a case recently in some goats here in northern Utah where some yew shrubs were trimmed and they took the clippings and fed those to the goats, and several of the goats died. This also tends to be a problem for some wildlife, such as elk and deer. You might have seen this on the news the last few years when we've had these winters that have been very cold and a lot of snow, and it's brought the animals down into the city. And one of the things they'll find are these evergreen shrubs like the yews, and they'll eat them. And there've been quite a few cases of elk and deer dying from eating yew. So another one plant that is kind of known for being poisonous to sheep, um, and it tends to be in the area where when they start to put sheep out in the spring, that this plant is death camas. And it tends to be one of the first plants that begins growing in the early spring. So when the sheep get put out in the foothills in the early spring, sometimes the grass hasn't started to grow yet. And or typically what happens a lot too is you'll get a late spring snowstorm that will cover the grass, and the death camas is a little taller, and so it'll stick up through the snow, and so the sheep will or cattle will see the death camas and they'll eat it more, and that's when several of the poisoning cases have occurred. Usually it begins to flower late April, early May. In the lower areas, up in the higher elevations, it's June and July. It is a short growing plant, so it's only there usually for a month or 2 months, and then it'll senesce and die. Um, there have been some areas where what we've seen recently too with death camas is some of these areas that have burned, the sagebrush and some of these other shrubs that tend to crowd out some of the forbs and grasses will be removed with the fire, and then post fire death camas tends to come back in um, and be pretty abundant in some of these areas, and we've seen some pretty large losses in some of these post fire areas. As I mentioned, sheep tend to eat death camas more than other livestock species, just due to the fact that it's a forb, and that's what they tend to prefer. But as I mentioned, cattle and horses can eat it and be poisoned from it. Clinical signs for an animal that's been poisoned with death camas. A lot of times, um, the sheep herder or livestock producer will leave for the day and come back in the morning and they'll find them dead. But if they're still alive, what you'll see is a lot of salivation, frothing around the mouth. You'll see vomiting or signs of vomiting. You'll see muscle weakness and staggering, and they tend to be struggling to breathe as it's a cardiovascular toxin. They will go down, and death can occur anywhere from a few hours of a large dose to a few days. It just depends on how fast they eat it and how much they ate. So what can you do to prevent poisoning from death camas? Well, obviously the number one prevention is just keep them away from the dense patches. But another general good rule is don't unload hungry sheep in a dense patch of death camas. And sometimes it's hard to control where you unload your animals after you've taken them from the winter ranges and trying to put them out on their spring pastures. But if you can try and avoid an area that is very dense in death camas, that would be good, because those animals are going to be hungry and they're going to be looking for anything they can, and that death camas might be very appealing to them. There's no treatment for death camas. Once they're poisoned, you just kind of have to let it run its course, and hopefully the animal will survive. If it does survive, it tends to be just fine. They'll recover and not have any lasting adverse effects. Death camas is a broadleaf forb, and so it can be easily controlled with herbicides. We've done some studies and we'll publish some papers recently where we've evaluated some of the newer herbicides, and you can see some of our plots here that we've shown that some of them will knock the death camas back pretty good. So moving on, the next one I wanted to talk about was kind of a little more historical for the sheep industry back in the mid 50s to early 60s. Up in central Idaho, this used to be a really big problem. It's a lot with this Veratrum californicum, or skunk cabbage, corn lily. It's got a lot of different names. But what they ran into is they had a lot of lambs that were being born with birth defects. And what we found is the pregnant ewes would eat this plant, the skunk cabbage, during the early period of gestation, and that would cause the birth defects. So some of the birth defects that are observed are these craniofacial defects, such as the one on the bottom left, which is the cyclops. The interesting thing is the time period for these malformations to occur is very short, very narrow. So for the craniofacial defects to occur, the pregnant ewe has to eat the plant on days 13 and 14 of gestation. Uh, if they eat the plant a little bit later, around day 28 to 31, you'll see some skeletal deformation, some arthrogryposis, and some bent limbs. There's my automatic light going off. Sorry for that. And then even another malformation that observed is what we're showing on the right is the trachea. The bottom is a trachea of a normal lamb, and the top is a trachea from a lamb whose mother ate the veratrum during days 31 to 33, and it causes this tracheal stenosis, or closing of the trachea. And that animal might look normal, but when it's born, it can't breathe, and so it will die shortly thereafter. To prevent the losses, the number one thing is just to avoid turning pregnant ewes into veratrum infested ranges until it's about 35 days after they were with the ram. Once you get past that susceptible period of gestation, then the ewes likely won't eat enough of the veratrum to cause any more adverse effects. And all of those developmental phases, such as the eyes and the face and all that, those will have already passed, and so the animals will be fine. You can control veratrum with herbicides. It does tend to grow in dense patches, and so if it's in an area where you're able to spray, you can control it with herbicides, or you can fence these patches and keep the animals out. Okay, so probably one of the biggest problematic plants for livestock in general in the Intermountain West is the locoweeds, the Astragalus and Oxytropis species that contain the toxin swainsinine. And I'm showing several of the pictures of an Oxytropis and Astragalus species here. All of these plants that contain swainsinine are considered local weeds and can have some pretty devastating impacts on livestock. All livestock species are susceptible to local weeds. Cattle, sheep, horses are extremely susceptible, which is where the name came from. The Spanish found that when their horses ate these plants that they would act crazy, and so they called it local weed. So this is just a map to show how widespread the local weed species are here in the Intermountain West, and you can see they're found everywhere. And so it's kind of hard to get away from the local weeds, and which is one of the reasons it can be a big problem. The one thing about local weeds is, so, death camas, the veratrum, those are all kind of acute toxins, that they only need to eat it once or, couple days, and they can get the acute toxicity. Where with the local weeds, it's a chronic toxicity, and the animals have to eat it consistently for several weeks, usually 2 to 3 weeks before you start to see signs of uh, poisoning. And some of those signs, some of the first things you'll see is the adverse behavior. You'll start to see a wasting. The animals look like they're just starting to not do well, and and even though they're eating a plant that's a legume that has a pretty high protein content. The things you might not see and might not notice until later on is the local weeds cause a really big problem with the reproductive capability of the animals, both in the males and the females. It will affect estrus. If the ewe is exposed to local weed before breeding season or right at the start of breeding season, she will not come into estrus, and so she will not breed. The males, it affects spermatogenesis and causes abnormal sperm production. And so it has some pretty significant effects on reproduction. The good thing is if they can get off of that, then those adverse effects will go away. The females will come back into estrus after a few weeks, and the males after, enough time has passed that normal spermatogenesis will occur. It does cause some developmental defects, as shown the lamb here on the left. You can see some skeletal deformities. And then the one thing that's interesting is that if these animals are eating the loquid up at very high elevations, as the cow that's here on the right on the bottom, will develop a heart failure, and you'll see this is will demonstrate it as a brisket disease. You'll see that swelling on the brisket. This only happens at very high elevations. The one area where I know it's happened several times is at an elevation of 9 to 10,000 feet. So how do we reduce losses to local weed? Well, the main thing is to try and avoid local weed during breeding season, and then also during pregnancy, as the fetus will be more susceptible than the adult animal. Due to the fact that it is chronic toxicity, you can use intermittent grazing programs where you can put them in a pasture that has a lot of loquid for a short 1 to 2 week period, and then move them to an area that is free of loquid and allow those toxins to pass. They're cleared very quickly within a day or two, and so it doesn't take very long for the animals to return to normal. However, if they get poisoned to the point that you start to see the neurological defects, um, those are more permanent, and the animals will probably not recover. So, for example, a horse that starts to act crazy, that behavior is a neurological effect, and it probably will not recover. The reproductive effects, as I mentioned, they can recover from that. They just need enough time to be on normal feed for everything to return to normal. So, for example, with the males, they need to be off local weed for about 90 days to recover all the normal spermatogenesis and have normal sperm for breeding. Another plant that tends to be a problem for sheep is lupin. This might be a little more commonly known in cattle because it causes a crooked calf disease, causes some skeletal defects in cattle, and this is pretty common in areas of Idaho and Oregon and Washington, depending on the lupin that the cattle are consuming. However, in sheep, it tends to be more of a problem when the lupin is in the pod stage. Those lupin pods are very high in the toxin, and it can poison and you can have a lot of losses in the sheep if they're trailed through an area in late summer that has a lot of lupin with the pods. Um, Again, how to reduce losses to lupin, just try and keep hungry animals away from the large patches, especially when it's in the seed stage, the pod stage. Supplemental feeding can help. Lupin, again, is a high protein content forage. So in the late summer, the grasses have started to senesce and food quality can be very low on some of these ranges. And so they're looking for nutritious forage, which can be lupin. So supplementing the feed can be a way to try and limit the amount of lupin they'll eat. If the sheep do start to become poisoned, it will cause a neuromuscular defect and they won't be able to move very well. And so the best thing to do is just leave them alone and let them recover. If you try and move them, it'll actually make things worse. There's no treatment for animals been poisoned. Again, you just kind of have to let nature run its course. And if the lupin is on an area where you can spray, there are some very good herbicides that you can use to try and control lupin. It is a good seed producer, as a lot of these poisonous plants are. And so if you're trying to control the plant with herbicide, it likely will take repeated sprayings to keep the lupin in control. So for all of you people that have sheep, probably are very well aware of the hazards of halogeton. It's an oxalate-containing plant. Greasewood is another plant that contains oxalates. And this can be a big problem on some of the winter ranges in the area here in the Intermountain West, because a lot of those winter ranges are areas where halogeton can become pretty dense and can cause problems. So the leaves tend to have the highest concentration of the oxalates, and the oxalates will bind with calcium and they'll form crystals, in which these crystals will deposit in the kidneys, and so it'll cause kidney problems in the sheep. And it also causes a hypocalcemia. It doesn't take a lot of halogeton if they're naive, if they haven't been exposed before. And so sheep that are brought into an area where they haven't been exposed to halogeton before, they can have some adverse effects by not eating very much halogeton. However, the interesting thing about halogeton, well, any oxalate containing plant, is that the rumen can very rapidly adapt to the oxalates. So if the animals can be slowly introduced to these oxalate containing plants, they can adapt. So most of the losses that occur tend to occur when they animals are brought into a new area and they haven't been eating oxalate containing plants, and they're hungry and they eat a lot of it. But if they can eat the plant slowly, they can build up a tolerance and then they'll be fine. The first signs of poisoning can occur within hours after the animal eating, and death can occur usually that day or by the next day. So again, supplemental feeding or just anything that you can try and do to make sure that hungry animals are not put out into an area where oxalate or these oxalate containing plants are abundant. So a common scenario again is animals are trucked into a new area. They're let off in an area that has water and some of those disturbed sites are where the halogeton tends to be very abundant. So these animals are hungry. They get off the truck, and the first thing they start to do is eat this halogeton. And as I mentioned, they haven't adapted to the halogeton, so they're going to eat a lot of it, and they're not ready. They're not haven't um, the ruminants haven't been adapted yet, and so that's when a lot of the losses will occur. So after long transport, if these animals can be let out in an area where it's not high concentration of halogen, or if they can be be fed before they are released, then they're not going to be hungry and they're not going to be as readily eating the halogen. Um, Halogeton can be controlled if it's caught early, but once it really gets established again, then it becomes very hard to control. So if you see it in an area, the best thing to do is try and get on top of it right away, because if you let it go, it just becomes a nightmare to try and control. As I mentioned, there are some other oxalate containing plants, the greasewood, the lamb's quarter, and the curly dock. They can all cause a similar syndrome, but they just don't tend to be as big of an issue as halogeton is. Horsebrush is another one that has caused problems for the sheep industry in the past. These plants have some compounds in it that will cause some adverse effects in the sheep, including big head and some photosensitization. Most of the losses occur when they're trailed through heavily infested areas, and sometimes this coincides with some stormy periods where those storms might alter their normal grazing behavior, and so they might eat more of the horsebrush than usual. Again, hungry sheep tend to eat more. That's just a general statement. And horsebrush tends to be the most toxic during the bud stage, but we don't know exactly why that is. And um, so again, to reduce losses, just avoid dense horsebrush ranges if possible. Don't let animals graze in infested areas immediately after watering or during stormy periods. Um, Move affected sheep to the shade as soon as possible. As you notice these signs, because as I mentioned, the photosensitization is the issue, so they need to get out of the sun. Give them supplemental feed if possible, and once they become poisoned, just leave them in the shade and try and let them recover. As these tend to be more of a shrubby, woody plant, there's not really a good economical method of control for these plants. So real quick, just to talk about a couple other plants that can be a problem, but are not as big of an issue as the ones that I've talked about. These include milkweed. There's a number of different milkweeds. Some are more toxic than others. Here in northern Utah and in this area, we have a lot of the showy milkweed, and this is not one of the what we consider very toxic species of milkweed. There's some of these other the labriform and some of these world milkweeds that tend to be more toxic. So um, just because you have a milkweed doesn't necessarily mean it's a toxic one. So milkweed can poison sheep and cattle. It's a cardiotoxin, so pretty much anything that eats it can be poisoned, uh, except for the monarch butterfly, right? So most livestock losses are a result of hungry animals concentrating around milkweed infested corrals, bed grounds, or driveways. You know, you tend to see this growing kind of in the ditch banks and the edges of the fields and pastures. It is, as I mentioned, it is very toxic. So it doesn't take a lot of green leaves for a sheep to die. And they will die usually within a few hours, but it can take a day or more. Again, if they're being put in an area where they're being trailed through an area where there's a lot of milkweed, you might want to consider supplemental feeding just so that they're not hungry looking for anything they can find. Milkweed is one of the plants that we know that if it gets baled up into hay, that it is still toxic. And so, those outside rows of a contaminated field that might have a lot of milkweed in it could be an issue for poisoning animals. um, it is one of these plants that you can control. You can spray for it. Some 2,4-D and glyphosate and some of these herbicides do a pretty good job in controlling milkweed. Hemp dogbane, it's another plant that has the cardiotoxins in it. It's very kind of similar to the milkweeds. It's not one of the plants that they readily eat. So what tends to happen is when the sheep are hungry and looking for additional food and they run out of other things to eat is when they start to eat the dogbane, the hemp dogbane. So there's a number of plants that grow on our rangelands that contain cyanide. Chokecherry, serviceberry are good examples of these. And I just did some experiments due to it was actually a sheep poisoning case that we thought was due to death camas. And we've done some subsequent studies and analyses and found out that sheep and goats are extremely susceptible to the toxicity of chokecherry. The cyanide in the chokecherry is extremely toxic to the sheep and goats, and it doesn't take very much to poison them. As with any cyanide containing plant, if anytime there's a frost or something like that, the plants tend to be more toxic. Um, Especially to monogastric animals such as horses. Ruminants, the leaves in that are toxic to them all the time because they have the bacteria that can break down and cleave the cyanide from the sugar. The berries are edible. That's why, a lot of people eat chokecherry pie and that. Generally it's the leaves that tend to be the problem for livestock. So obviously that means it's not a good idea to plant chokecherry shrubs or trees or serviceberry in areas where livestock can be exposed to. So that's pretty much all I have that I wanted to share with you today. What I'm showing here is just a slide that we have an app, if you're not already aware of it, that has a lot of the information on most of the most problematic plants in the Intermountain West for livestock, and it's available in the App Store for both Android and Apple. And you can use these QR codes or to get access to this. It's just a poisonous plant app. If you do a search for that, you should be able to find it in the App Store. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Kevin. Always a huge wealth of knowledge. I mean, understanding all those plants is just as difficult as knowing that many species of animals. So pretty impressive. You're already getting a pretty good host of questions. I think it's important to know that a lot of our people come from all over the US and even other countries too. You
Yeah,
guys are an international recognized poisonous plant center, and you do get samples from all over. And so I like that you shared the app with them, and any other stuff you could hand over would be great too.
yeah.
So one of the first questions kind of comes from about Buckeyes. So I assume this is, near the Buckeye State, right? Buckeyes are known to be toxic. Are they readily eaten by sheep or goats, and or are they less of a concern?
I would assume, just so the Buckeyes one that we don't do a lot with, so as you mentioned, Chad, we do work all over the world. We collaborate with people all over the world, kind of where our specialties are, and we are the only poisonous plant lab for the USDA in the United States. So we do cover the United States, but we tend to focus on the plants that are here in the Intermountain West because these are where our public rangelands are, and this tends to be where we get most of the feedback about poisonous plants issues. So I am aware of the buckeye and that it is poisonous and toxic, but it's not one that I'm real familiar with and don't have a lot of, it's not one that we have readily studied. So if that person who asked the question would like to email me,
Okay.
my email is just kevin.welch@usda.gov. I don't know if I
And
could.
I can try to type that in the chat too for everybody.
Yeah, if you just want to put that in the chat, then have them email me, and then I can look up some more specific information in some of the texts and literature that I have available that I just don't have on the top of my head.
Okay, that sounds great. Um, Another question is the carcasses of or I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. YEW, yo killed
Yep,
livestock.
yep,
You killed livestock. Is that toxic to predators or dogs? Like
yep.
if they were to consume that?
Yeah, so that's, relay toxicity or secondary toxicity is something that can always be an issue. I am not aware of any studies that have been done. The U is a cardiotoxin, and so it's going to affect the heart primarily. Uh, and it is so toxic that the amount in the animal, whether they just ate, if a coyote or a dog runs on a dead animal and starts to eat some skeletal muscle or, some of the organs in that, I don't know if they would get enough. Something I'm not really sure about. It is a possibility always.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to maybe the dilution aspect, right? The concentration you were talking about.
Well, and so, I mean, in that regard, kind of our general rule of thumb is that we recommend that any animal that has been exposed to poisonous plants has a period of kind of letting things clear out before they're sent to market, or, before the, if a pregnant animal or a lactating animal, I guess is the more correct term, a lactating animal is exposed, then you want to make sure that that milk is not sent to market, because that milk a lot of these toxins, especially like swainsonine and some of these other toxins, we know are secreted in the milk. And so some of these products, you can get that, secondary relay toxicity. So, like, for example, our lab, we have the rule that any animal that's on study, that we won't sell that animal for 30 days, just to give it enough time to make sure that it's all of the plant toxins have cleared.
Yeah, interesting. Um, I know there's you guys have so much information available to you, and things that you've done, but talking about death camas, do you think you can talk a little bit about where its ranges are? We have a producer who's asked, could it be found in south central, southwest Kansas? They had an animal that felt like they had similar symptoms, of what you talked about when you talked about death camas.
So yeah, I mean, on this map I'm showing here, this is the Zygodenus paniculatus, which is foothill death camas, and it's just saying that you can find it anywhere in the western US, which in this map is not including Kansas, but there are other species, and you know, things tend to change, so it's very possible that there's death camas in that part of Kansas.
If if some producers have animals die that they may suspect, um, cause of death by poisonous plants, how do they go about maybe sending in the carcass or samples to a vet diagnostic lab, or how should they go about that
Yeah,
process?
no, that's a great question. So we can actually, if it's one of these, primarily almost any of these plants that I've talked about today, we have the capability of doing diagnostic analyses. And generally, we tend to use rumen content. You know, if the animal has died very recently, and it's not too onerous of a task to collect some rumen samples, that's a very good way to, if the animal's still alive, you might be able to collect some blood and send us the blood. Um, we've actually done some research with death camas and lupin and a few of these plants where we've found that the toxins are secreted into the earwax. And so, in a dead animal, you could collect some earwax, if it's been dead for a day or two and you don't want to open it up and collect rumen samples, you could collect some earwax and send us the earwax and we can analyze that. There are some diagnostic labs that have capabilities to do that. But you can contact us and see if it's something that we can do. It is part of our mission is to help, diagnose cases of poisoned animals.
Okay. I'm seeing a lot of questions roll in, so I just wanted to remind our producers here that if you have a question, feel free to write it in the Q&A. We'll try to get it to it as best as we can. Due to respecting time, we're probably going to cut this off around 1 o'clock. And if you do have further questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Welch. Do you want to say your email one more time, Kevin?
Yeah, so it's just my name, kevin.welch@usda.gov.
Okay. And then this is being recorded, so we will upload this to the extension page for on YouTube with the University of Idaho, and so you can find this further. Um, some other questions that are coming through, Kevin, is a lot of them are very species specific to the plants, but for a producer dealing with poison hemlock, where could they find more information about that plant for their area? Is the app a really good
Yeah,
spot
so
starting?
poison hemlock is one that we have in our app. And then if you'll do a Google search for our lab, so sorry, USDA Poisonous Plant Research Lab. And then on our website, we actually have all that same information that's in the app on our website, so you can access that either way. Or again, email me.
Okay. Lamb's quarter. Have a producer with some goats that eat varying amounts of lamb's quarter depending on the stage of production of the plant.
Yep.
No, people eat it as well. Do you think you could expound a little bit on how or why it's toxic to small ruminants?
So lamb's quarter is another one of those that has the oxalates in it. And so it's one that, as I mentioned, if the animals can eat small amounts and kind of adapt to it, they'll be fine. It's just if they eat a lot of it very quickly when they haven't been exposed to it previously, that's when they can have the issues. So yeah,
Okay.
it's one of these that, just because you eat it doesn't mean they're gonna die. They have to um, have not been exposed to it recently and then eat quite a bit of it.
So for our producers that are lambing, lactating, and losing a lot of body condition, um, just making, I mean, what would be a recommendation is not turning them out onto a range that has poisonous plants with that low body condition, or trying to put some back on them before you turn them out, or
Yeah, you know, it everything's a risk benefit.
right.
Um, because yeah, those, that ewe is gonna be nutritionally compromised. She's just given birth and she's lactating and she needs a lot of energy. And so she's gonna be trying to find anything she can to eat. And so yeah, supplementing in a case like that is gonna be a good, safe way to try and meet those energy demands without them just indiscriminately going out there and finding whatever they can. And and if they're depending on when they lamb, how does that coincide when death camas is very abundant? So it's kind of a case by case scenario, and everything's a risk benefit. It costs money to supplement them.
Yeah.
If you only lose one or two ewes, but if you're gonna lose, if you've lost quite a few, then yeah, maybe it's worthwhile to supplement them.
Right. And it's also, all that budget is concerned with size of operation,
Yep.
economy of scale type stuff.
Yeah. But that
Um,
also, when you mention that, that's one thing to take into consideration is, if you have a fairly large pasture or range and only a handful of sheep, they're not gonna graze that to the ground where, a full band of 1,000, they're gonna go through that and hit it pretty hard so,
yeah, yeah, they have more opportunity to be selective.
but the 1,000 of them are probably each only gonna eat a few of the poisonous plants too. So with locoweed, that's actually what some people recommend is to go in with a higher concentration, higher animal numbers so that each animal has less chance to eat the locoweed.
Mhm.
Because what we've found
Yeah.
with locoweed, especially with cattle, is they tend to almost develop a preference for it. And so they'll almost walk from plant to plant.
Do you see that with maybe other species with small ruminants? Like, do you like tall larkspur is one that kind of comes to mind. Does
Yeah.
it become a preference at all, or
Uh, we still have some questions about that. But with fortunately larkspur for sheep and goats is not an issue, but for cattle it is. And we do see some areas where it looks like they go in and almost clip off the flower um, part of the larkspur. But
Another thing, and this is a little um, some of the research I've done where we're looking at these spots of tall larkspur, a lot of it is in very shaded, heavy tree coverage and downfall, which I wonder how utilized it gets by these small ruminants. Like, is it that they're not selecting those plants, or is it that they're not selecting for the terrain that those plants prefer to grow in?
so Derek Scosta over in and
Wyoming.
yeah, and I just blanked on his name. The sheep specialist in Wyoming.
Whit Stewart.
Yeah, Witt. They've been doing some experiments where they're trying to show what it takes to get sheep to actually go in and kind of graze the larkspur, because for some reason sheep really don't like it, even though it doesn't poison them. They tend to avoid it, and so they show that they had to have higher density. So they're trying to figure out how many animals does it take for them to utilize that, but not just decimate the grasses and, leave something for the cattle. So um, there have been some instances where some of these tall larkspur plants populations species kind of grow in dense patches, and you can take a band of sheep in there and kind of, they might not eat it, but they might uh, if they trail through that, they might pack it down, and then the cows won't eat it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that that's kind of an interesting concept to just trample the plants.
Yeah.
So there's a question in here that I think is really interesting, and that's a question about what kind of a toolbox can a producer have if they are facing a lot of these different types of poisonous plants? Is there something that they could have on hand, like a charcoal or something that you could maybe kind of broadly treat rather than trying to figure out which one specifically might be the problem?
It'd be nice to have a magic bullet. Um, so the one plant that we do kind of have a good antidote for is larkspur. But that's not an issue for sheep and goats. But for cattle, there is a drug that you can give to cattle that have been poisoned by larkspur, and it reverses the effects of the larkspur toxins. But again, some of these plants like larkspur, it's a very acute, death camas, lupin, that's an acute toxicity, and so sometimes you'll check them the night before, and then you go to bed and wake up in the morning, and they're might already be dead.
Yeah.
Some of the other longer, chronic things such as local weed, you don't really have to worry about treating it. You just need to remove them from the exposure.
Okay.
Charcoal, activated charcoal, so we've actually done some experiments with activated charcoal and found that it doesn't work as well as we would have thought it would. So,
That's interesting.
yeah.
I'm gonna pick one more question here.
Yeah.
Round out the hour. Chad, did you have one you wanted to ask? Um,
Uh, I'll let you go ahead and choose
okay.
it.
The one question here talks about their sheep really loving to graze on the wild parsnip, and obviously the phototoxin skin response that you mentioned, but is there any other reason why they should be encouraging those animals to avoid it outside of that specific thing?
Should be okay. Yeah, as long as they're not getting the photosensitivity issues. Don't get it, as long as they're not getting a big enough dose that they get then they should be okay.
Okay. So I'd say most of the rest of the questions, and I apologize to everybody that we didn't get to, but most of the questions are specific to a location or a specific type of plant. So I'd encourage you to check out the app or shoot an email to Dr. Welch to discuss that further, just for the sake of time here. So thank you so much for everybody that joined us today. It was a great turnout. And Dr. Welch, thank you for joining us and sharing
You
your
bet.
insight as well. And again, like Chad mentioned, this will be posted to our YouTube channel so that if you want to go back and check out some of the information at a different time, that would work. And if you don't mind filling out our survey as you guys jump off, and then we'll see you in a month for our May edition. And I know we're getting busy coming into summer, but we'll still be here every month. So thank you all for joining us, and you guys have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Welch.
You bet, anytime.